Stealing Freedom, Chapter 12. Sleep. Sleep was the only thing that brought her peace. Anne moved through her days as if she were dragging a sack of rocks with each step. There was no rhythm now, nothing to look out, look out, look out for. All the worst had happened. Mistress Carroll demanded that a late garden be planted in the yard behind their rented frame house in Rockville. She wanted all of her belongings unpacked carefully and the canned goods carried down to the dark, musty basement. And she expected the clothes and linens to be washed regularly, 3 meals cooked on time, and the small kitchen to be swept every day. Mistress Carroll was used to the help of several women around the house and seemed to think that Anne could do all of the work she used to share with her mother and sister. She complained constantly that if her husband wasn't so greedy, he would have left her with some real household help instead of this ignorant child. Not only was the work too much for one person, especially one person slowed by heavy sadness, but in addition, Anne was not a very good cook. Burned porridge, over-salted stew, and meat as tough and stringy as a horse harness became common in the Price's kitchen. She'd always been a helper in the kitchen in Unity, but never had full responsibility for the meal. All of Anne's offenses, her slowness, her mistakes, her ruining of precious food, made Mistress Carroll as angry as a wet cat. She kept a short, fat stick next to the hearth and used it regularly. "Wake up! Were you planning to sleep all day?" And down came the stick on Anne's head. "Watch that pot, you lazy wench. You burn it, and that's all you'll have to eat for 3 days." A blow landed across Anne's shoulders. Some days, her shoulders and arms were so sore from the beating, she felt as though she'd been tumbled in a corn sheller, and her head had lumps that made it difficult to find a comfortable way to sleep on the kitchen floor, which, now that there was no slave quarters, had become her bed. Anne took the punishment in silence, too deadened inside to much care. The first Sunday Anne was in Rockville, and every Sunday after that, her cousin Hannah came to call. Sometimes David came with her. Hannah was a few years older than Augustus with long, straight hair she kept in a bright red head wrap most of the time. David was a little older than Hannah, with dark, serious eyes and strong shoulders from hard work. Her cousin's request was always the same. "Come on now, Anne Maria. Come to St. Mary's with us. Church will do you good, and afterward we'll go visiting." But Anne would shake her head, her eyelids heavy. Sunday was the one day she could escape into sleep for all the hours she was required to be alive. No promise of church singing or visiting could tempt her to give up that escape. She would go to the edge of their yard and lie down under a tree. There were flies and gnats keeping her company, or with the flies and gnats keeping her company, she would drift off into dreams of sunny days in Unity, of skipping rocks with her brothers, cooking with her mother and Catherine, or gardening with her father while Benjamin played in the dirt nearby. The only thing that woke her from time to time was the ringing of the bell at St. Mary's Catholic Church up the hill. One Sunday, the bell woke her with a start, and try as she might, she could not sink back into sleep. There was a warm drizzle falling, and the dampness of her clothes made her skin itch. She sighed and sat up. The bell stopped, and it was quiet except for the late summer chirpings of crickets and cicadas. The service at St. Mary's was over. Soon Hannah and David and the other slaves and free blacks would be going to their afternoon gatherings. Likewise, the white worshippers would be leaving for their own Sunday dinners. Hannah had explained to Anne how St. Mary's was the only church in Rockville where whites and blacks worshiped together. Though the whites sat in the pews in the main part of the church and the blacks sat in the tier in the back, up high where no one from down below could see them. Anne was curious about the church. Too clammy and itchy to sleep anymore, she rose and walked up the hill. By now the churchyard was empty. The small white brick building stood quietly. Tall, wide oaks protected the gravestones from the soft rain. Anne ran her hand over one stone. It was rough and caught on her skin. Suddenly she heard voices. She ran to the edge of the graveyard and lay down in the tall grass. She watched as a white man dressed in religious robes led a white couple into the graveyard. "Thank you very much, Father Doherty," said the woman. "I know there must not be many people who make this request. "I'm happy to do it, Mrs. Fitzgerald," said the priest. "I figure I'll be resting here soon enough," said the other man. "Might as well be sure I like the location." "Michael, please don't talk that way," said the woman. "There's no reason to have one foot in the grave already." "Don't worry, Cecilia. You won't bury me until I'm good and ready." "Here it is," said the priest. They talked a little more about how nice the grave sites were, close to the church, under the shade of the grand trees. Mr. Fitzgerald teased his wife about how she'd be joining him there someday, and she shushed him. When they left, Anne stood up from the grass and brushed herself off. Something about their conversation had fascinated her. They'd talked about death as resting. Hadn't that become her one respite from the heaviness of her life? Rest, sleep. She glanced over the small collection of gravestones and suddenly felt jealous of the peaceful souls lying under the damp grass. They never had to wake up to sadness or grief or blows from a mistress's stick. She kneeled in front of a headstone and traced the engravings with her finger. She knew nothing of letters, but the numbers she could read. 1852. The person below her had been dead only 2 years. What did it feel like to never have to wake up? What did it feel like to rest peacefully forever? Anne lowered herself to the ground and stretched out on her back with the top of her head against the headstone. She was lying, she realized, just a few feet above the corpse. Could she, too, feel the peace of death? She folded her arms over her chest to make her body look like those she'd seen at funerals. She lifted her face to the gray sky and closed her eyes. Then she made her breathing as small as she could and imagined that she was finding eternal rest in peace. She didn't hear the creeping footsteps, and she didn't hear the pounding heart, but Anne did hear the terrified scream. She leaped up from her imagined grave and raced out of the churchyard, quick as a rabbit. She glanced back only once to catch a glimpse of chestnut arms and legs sticking out of a dress as shapeless and colorless as her own.